everyone, and welcome to this current edition of my LinkedIn live streams. So really quick, just going to make sure the stream is actually working. And while I do that, I will remind you that our next topic is going to be another content UX audit. If you want to be sorry, I'm just trying to get this working, and so far it's not telling me that it is. If you want me to review your content as part of this content UX audit, then just use this link at the bottom of the screen, that blogsmith.tips without the vowels, /content UX. It just asks for your URL and your name and any details that may or may not be relevant to doing the audit. You can fill it out as much or as little as you want. I'm going to try something else to make sure that this is working. So just bear with me for a moment and I'll kind of just talk about the last UX audit we did. It was for Todoist. Got a lot of great feedback for that one, so might do something similar to that in the future. But again, happy to take any audience requests for these audits. Oh man, it is just being very difficult to confirm that this is working. I do see some viewers, so I think I'm just gonna have to go with that for right now, and get started on our topic for today. So today we're talking about, is it plagiarism to use AI generated content? This is something that I have been thinking about for a while and just finally actually articulated in a useful way on our blog. So I'm going to be kind of going through the blog, but really calling attention to the pieces that are, most notable in terms of actually answering this question. So flipping to the view of the blog so you can kind of follow along as I go through. So probably not a surprise to most of you who are watching this, but this topic comes from just the conversation that's happening in the world at large. Once AI tools, and especially generative AI tools, which are the ones that create content, whether that's written, visual, etc., once these AI tools became commercialized and the world at large had access to them, it created a lot of opportunities. It also created a lot of potential problems, and so that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. And so I think the first thing that's useful to talk about in this conversation, I guess what really inspired me to write this post is a conversation that I had with somebody that I was blindly matched with on a networking platform called Lunch Club. And this person, content wasn't necessarily a big part of what she does, but she was using this platform. It's kind of like ChatGPT, but it's interesting in that it's a different platform and it kind of has this like multi-level marketing approach to how it works. I'm not going to name it here. You could probably find it with just AI and something about multi-level marketing and generative text and things like that. But she was telling me how she was using this tool to create some resources for her clients, and was saying, that might be useful to you as a content creator because, the way that it works, it just keeps rewriting articles. And then at that point, it's not plagiarism. And I was just like absolutely floored in this conversation that she's essentially kind of like nullifying the real work that we do, which is like spending a lot of time thoughtfully creating content, but really just like misunderstanding, I think, what plagiarism is. Because I guess, like, to jump ahead a little bit, let's talk about the different types of plagiarism. So direct plagiarism is what most people are most familiar with, and it's literally using somebody else's words verbatim, not giving them credit, not quoting the text, and passing it off as your own. So that's the type of plagiarism that most people are familiar with. Then there's this thing called mosaic plagiarism, also known as patch writing, which is taking phrases from a source without crediting them or copying somebody else's ideas and replacing a couple words with synonyms, and again, not crediting them. So that's kind of what this person who really inspired this post was talking about in a sense, which is, just keep rerunning that generative AI tool until you get something that looks different, but is still based on somebody else's work. There's also self-plagiarism, which is like, you're kind of like taking from your own body of work. And my opinion is it's not really a good or a bad thing. It's only bad if you're being purposefully deceptive. I would say from the client perspective, if you're plagiarizing work you did for one client with another, I would say that's also pretty bad. But if it's something like for example, my book, maybe I wrote something in my book and then I'm resharing that on social without necessarily saying like this is a verbatim, this is taking text verbatim from my book. I wouldn't necessarily call that a bad form of plagiarism because I'm still presenting it as my idea. It was my idea there. It's still my idea here. It's not implicating a client that has purchased my work. So that's another thing to think about. And then there's accidental plagiarism, which is like you're not trying to do it on purpose, but maybe you don't have great quality standards in order to catch these things. Or maybe you don't care, and that's also just a bad thing in general. And so where I think AI generative content falls is mostly in this like mosaic sort of level of plagiarism. So I just wanted to define the different types so that you kind of understand what we're talking about, that AI isn't necessarily direct plagiarism, but it can be, and I do have an example of that I want to share. So now that we have talked about that, it's probably a good idea to also just talk about like where does AI get the data that it uses to respond to your prompts and suggest answers. And so every AI tool has its own data source. They're different. Some of them are very forthcoming with where that data is coming from. OpenAI is pretty general. They say that they were trained on vast amounts of data from the internet written by humans. So, I mean, I guess it's good that they acknowledge that, it is definitely coming from other people. I mean, I think we all know that at this point. But what it doesn't say is specifically where it's getting that data from or that it has the rights to use it, for example. And so the rest of this is just kind of talking about the fact that it's like data scraping. It's not necessarily like engaging in deals to use this content, which we then use as consumers. And yeah, it's obtained without explicit consent. And so that's I think a big tenet of plagiarism in general is the fact that like you're not really interfacing with that original creator. So how would you know that they're okay with you using their work? And that's unfortunately a big problem, I think, with AI generative content that uses large amounts of data from across the internet and they're not attributing it. All right, so I think you're starting to probably get the idea of where I fall on the scale of is AI generated content plagiarism or not, but let's dive in a little bit further. So I like this part. If your AI generated text copies words from another source verbatim, paraphrases too closely, or presents another creator's original thoughts or ideas without proper citation, that's plagiarism. According to the Blogsmith, this is our definition of it. And I had another conversation, and again, with somebody on Lunch Club. There's something about Lunch Club that leads to these different hot takes on AI and generative content, and I would say especially from people outside of the industry. So that's what's really interesting is like I think people within the industry have kind of like, their take, and then there's people who are completely outside of it, who are like this person who inspired this particular article and this approach, who she's just kind of unaware. I don't think that she's purposefully trying to plagiarize or to like nullify somebody else's work or, like make money at their expense, but it doesn't necessarily excuse her either. And so one of these conversations that I had on Lunch Club where I brought up, I think that AI is plagiarism. This other person brought up a very fair point, which was that, as humans, like we engage with other people's work and we're inspired by it. I mean, there's that book, Steal Like an Artist. And it's so true. There's nothing that is like truly novel in the world anymore. I don't think it's because we all build off of each other's work. And so is that plagiarism? I don't think so. But my counter, now that I've had a chance to think about it, to this person who's saying, if these tools are kind of operating like humans and that they're building off of other people's work, then what would make them a plagiarist over a human doing a similar thing? And so this next part, and I'm going to read it because, now that I've had a chance to think about it, it's like the words matter in terms of explaining it. But essentially, as humans, we perform research and use the work of other creators to inform our own. That's what I was just saying. And ideally, of course, with proper credit and citation. The difference is that each human processes and then interprets their research differently to create something that is new. It might not be novel, right? But it's building something new from it's like a derivative work of sorts, you could say. When an AI references human work to generate content, they don't have a brain, right? AI is a tool that uses probabilities and statistics in order to suggest the best answer. So they're not processing it like a human would. So, and not only that, what they give you doesn't necessarily include citation. It depends on the AI tool that you use. And you can also press, the AI tool afterwards to say something like, where did you get this? Can you give your sources? So like ChatGPT is not necessarily forthcoming with that information, but you could prompt it and probably get at least some of it. I think something like Perplexity is a lot better about, being forthcoming. So it depends on the tool. But again, ChatGPT is kind of like the first mover, the one that has, the most users. And so again, if that's what most people use and it's not forthcoming with sources, like that is a problem. And so essentially it's AI generated content is really a regurgitation of data that it's been trained on without adding any sort of unique and individual perspective. And for me as a human, it's like, personally, that's not the type of content that I want to spend my time reading. Depends, of course, on the use case, right? Because it's like, for me, I use AI for a lot of things, and this is getting a little bit outside of what we're talking about today. But one thing that I really like about using a tool like ChatGPT is that I can use it to sort of I can get what I want quicker with customization, and I'll explain what I mean by that, than I could if I go on to search. And specifically for me, I'm mostly talking about like recipes and making food and things like that. And so one example I've given people is I recently got the KitchenAid ice cream maker attachment. And I really wanted to make froyo with it. I had some specific ingredients and specific flavors in mind. And I was just thinking, it's going to take me forever to find an existing piece of content that not only shows me how to make this particular flavor that I'm looking for, which is getting in the weeds of flavors, but also using that particular implement, the KitchenAid one. Because there's all sorts of different tools that people use that creators, might create content about. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to ask ChatGPT because I'm looking for a very specific use case. And in this case, using the data that it has, it can kind of combine these different experiences, right, to give me my perfect experience. And it did, and it worked out really well. I, had prompted it with some other things that I wanted to try once I had that base foundational recipe. And I'm also not using that recipe commercially, right? This was just me messing around in the kitchen. I guess you could say if we're talking about it ethically, maybe it does hurt somebody. Maybe it hurts a creator that I went through ChatGPT, that it may have been trained on their data to do that. And so that's a bigger question here, a bigger thing than I think what we're talking about with generative AI and using what you create with generative AI to make money for your business. So yeah, I'm just gonna leave it at that. That AI, just to kind of summarize this, it's AI can add value, but what it lacks is actual experience, because I still had to take that recipe, use it, and make adjustments and things like that. So AI couldn't solve that whole problem for me. It took some of the brain work out of making those initial recipe adjustments for that initial tool. So anyway, I'm getting way too into the weeds with that. Let's keep going here to talk about the real implications, I think, of what I'm getting at. Like, if you were to take generative AI and just take it at face value, don't make any changes, using a tool like ChatGPT, for example, what would happen if you then publish that on your website for your business? So OpenAI has been taken to court by the New York Times. There's an ongoing lawsuit. I don't think that it's necessarily resolved at this point, but the New York Times, of course, they have a huge body of work, so it's easy enough to prove. They have found examples, what they say near verbatim excerpts from Times articles that, you know, have then gone through ChatGPT. People have used that, published it, and, you know, New York Times isn't getting credited for that. So all of this is a huge problem for journalists, for content creators, you know, for visual content creators too. I'm mostly talking about this in terms of written content, but all these same points more or less apply to visual content creation as well, because AI tools are getting trained on data sets for creators, right? And they're not necessarily, it's not necessarily coming back to them that like their work was used for something that then somebody else can profit off of or use to benefit their business. So at the end of the day, anyone who uses generative AI that is trained on other people's data may not own the copyright to it. I mean, this is the main issue I think that we're talking about here. And so eventually, like, you could be held liable for plagiarism and copyright infringement. And, you know, there's question as to, like, if it's your byline on it, I mean, I think that implicates you. If it's not, you know, maybe there's a little bit less feasibility that you would get sued. What I could tell you at the Blogsmith is that I have every writer that works with me sign a document that says, I will not plagiarize. I will not use AI content to do that. I also will not plagiarize in general. And if I do, there is like a fine associated with that if I can prove it. So people shouldn't pay somebody for new content and get generated AI content. It's okay, obviously, if you have that agreement, right? And you're transparent about it. And transparency is another interesting thing that we're going to talk about here shortly. But at the Blogsmith, we have a zero tolerance policy for AI generated content, and I will continue to explain why that is. One thing I will say, a caveat here, is that there are AI tools that you can use very effectively that are trained on your own body of work. And I think that's an excellent use case for AI. I think there are many great use cases for AI, and that's why I keep talking about them. It's because there is so much potential. At the same time, because they came to market so fast, without a lot of, you know, government oversight, without a lot of probably like user testing and things like that. Like, everybody's so anxious, right, to use this exciting new tool that it's like all these new applications keep being introduced and coming to market, but we haven't like fully understood how to best use them, right? And so that's why we're at this point where we are right now. But anyway, so one of the great use cases, I think what I was trying to say is just that they're in their infancy. Like AI tools in general, generative AI, they have a long way to go, and I do believe that they will increasingly become like a greater part of all our workflows, up to and including generating content in probably the near future. That being said, where we're at right now is not a place where you can just do one prompt and have a blog post and there won't be any, you know, negative consequences from that. And I'm going to get into a couple of reasons why. But before I do that, there are some tools that you can use that you can train on your own data, and I think that's a great use case. I don't think it's going to fully solve any problems for you, but I think that it can get you, it can create efficiencies in your workflow. And so like Grammarly has a lot of interesting generative AI and just AI in general properties and features, and so we've been playing with that at the Blogsmith. One of the main use cases that we use it for is they have a custom style guide feature where you can, I don't know if I would call this like an AI feature though, but they have a custom style guide where you can preload it with like your writing styles, your preferred spellings, like the right way to spell the brands that you write about, proper, you know, capitalization, punctuation, whatever. And then another great tool is custom GPTs. I did 4 weeks ago If you look, back on my LinkedIn or on YouTube, I did a step-by-step walkthrough for how you could create your own custom GPT. And one use case that I think is really great is giving it your brand style guidelines or writing guidelines, and then asking it to review copy. I wouldn't give it like a whole blog post to review, but maybe like a passage or something like that. Or like a social post would be a really great use case. And basically say like, is this adhering to the style guidelines? Why or why not? How would you improve it? These are all excellent use cases for AI tools. So I'm going to keep moving forward to talk again more about the like sort of ethical implications and considerations, and also like the SEO potential fallout, and also just like Google's guidelines in general and what they say. So, another thing that's worth saying, and I can't remember where this comes in exactly. Oh, it's here. I think it's important to have standards outside of whatever you think about if AI is going to be useful to you or not. But it's just like, if we sink to the level of this piece looks good enough that I don't think that an AI or plagiarism detector is going to catch it, even though I either plagiarized or like otherwise used generative AI, then it's fine. I think that we're doing everyone a really great disservice, because if we're not actively involved in the process, however we use like these different tools and whatever end results they give us, then we're not, it's like I don't want to stand behind that piece of content if I haven't been involved in like every word, as the person with the byline. Google certainly hasn't forbidden the use of generative AI to rank in relevant search. In fact, their guidelines are, they don't really say either way. They don't say that it's going to get in the way, and they don't say that it's going to be something that would like prevent you from ranking. And I would definitely recommend you look at these. I'll just pull them up really quick. But this FAQ section is really interesting to look through. I think at the end of the day, it's important to read between the lines. So even though they don't take a hardline stance in these guidelines, they have taken a more hardline stance in their series of helpful content updates, which in September of, what are we in, 2024? In September 2023, many, like thousands of websites were de-indexed because of their like very sloppy use of AI generated content. It was very blatant. It wasn't like a read between the lines thing. It was like, this is very clearly AI content, and it is not totally relevant to the purpose of this website. So to me, it's like, that makes sense, right? Like, you don't necessarily need Google to tell you why that's a problem. But again, if you read between the lines, I think it's very clear that like Google's not forthcoming with taking a hardline stance. At the same time, they say, like, if we just go back here, they talk about some of like the principles of EEAT and like uniqueness, useful, helpful, original. I think we've already like established, at least if you're kind of following along with what I'm saying, the generative AI content is by nature not original, right? Because it is a derivative of somebody else's work. And we're also, there's a difference too between creating a piece that leverages some generative AI versus creating a piece that is totally generative AI. In either case, the Blogsmith still wouldn't mess with either one of those. But I do think there is a difference. And in the former case, it's like there's probably a lot more oversight on that piece versus the one where it's like a one prompt, okay, cool, good enough. So, but read between the lines is what I'm saying. And how can something rank in relevant search if Google's saying it has to be original, it has to be authoritative, it has to be expert, when it's created by AI? And especially if you're forthcoming about saying that, which you should be if you are doing that. And I will give you another example of that in just a moment. So then there's also like the big major problem. This isn't so much plagiarism, but this is more of like the ethics of what you put in front of a reader. This is like the trust that you create with your content for people to eventually buy from your brand. I think it gets really eradicated when we think about this from like the fact checking angle. And the fact that AI is confidently incorrect. And I've seen so many examples of this. I'm sure you have too. I wanted to start by saying I went to the Build a Better Agency Summit a couple months back, and there was something one of the presenters, Jim Stern, said that really stuck with me. And he said AI is really useful for generating ideas, but it's like really unreliable for determining facts. And so whatever you do in terms of adding AI to your workflow, I want you to try to keep that in mind. Like, it is a great brainstorming partner. It's a great sort of like assistant for doing like rote tasks. You know, it's like make me some like Excel formula to do this in my sheets or whatever, you know, like stuff like that. It would take me forever to figure that out, or to like read a bunch of articles, you know, to get there and experiment. Like, that's where AI is really great. But when it comes to just making statements, like, that is where it fails, especially right now. And I think that talking about like Google's AI overviews, which, you know, they like rush to market like all of these AI tools because everybody's so excited, right? And like, I get it. I'm excited about it too. They rush to market, but then you get stuff like, what are the health benefits of taking a bath with the toaster? Like, do it, you know? That's what the AI overview said. And it's like, obviously don't, right? And like, we as humans, for the most part, have that that ability to process and understand when information is being presented to us, and we probably shouldn't follow it. But not everybody does. And sometimes it's harder to read between the lines and to make that determination. And as content creators, as marketers, as people with ethics, I think, not doing our due diligence when it comes to generating AI content and literally fact checking every single claim does our audience a great disservice. And it could be dangerous, depending. So that's my cautionary tale. And Google did roll back their AI overviews. I think they are starting to come back, you know, in leaps and bounds. But, you know, there were so many examples of things that were just, they were like this. They didn't make any sense, and they were dangerous. And that's really bad. Okay, so I told you that I was going to give you an example of a company that did disclose where they used AI. This is one of my favorite examples because they just messed up so spectacularly that there's a lot for us to learn from it. So I do want to give props to CNET for being very forthcoming with the fact that they were publishing AI generated content. And then they also said, we have like a human subject matter expert editor who is going through these articles before they're published. So it wasn't just prompt and published. At least that's what we were led to believe. There was this investigative series done by Futurism for the series of these known AI generated articles, ones that they came forward and said that they were creating, where they investigated like what actually happened there. And this is kind of like the how they presented it, just as like something that we can learn from, how they presented being forthcoming with it. So, the problem is that there were two major issues, at least that I read about. The first one that you can see here is blatant plagiarism. So this is kind of like side-by-side comparisons of both the headlines of the articles and then some excerpts from these two articles. One was the CNET AI-generated article, and the other was a previously published Forbes article. And so as you can see, fundamentally the same with this excerpt, right? And like, is it nitpicking? I mean, maybe, but at the same time, like, we have some clear examples here, just like I'm sure New York Times is doing with OpenAI, where it's like, no, like, I can definitely see like that this came from there, and that's a problem. And the ultimate problem, I think, for us as humans using AI generated content and AI tools is that we're not going to see this, right? Because we're not going to, like, how do I say this? It's like when you create an article that's similar to something that's already out there, I think it is your job to go, and especially if you're working with a writer, I think that due diligence is looking at like the top search results and being like, I need to make sure that this writer that I'm working with, you know, didn't get overly inspired by something here. Whether it's purposeful or not, I think it's important to understand the competitive landscape. Even if you don't look at it from a plagiarism perspective, you still need to know like what's out there. And so the problem is with like this like one prompt or however they did it, they didn't do that because they didn't think they needed to. And so it became kind of a crutch. AI became a crutch in this situation because they didn't even know about this Forbes article, perhaps. They certainly didn't take it into consideration before they published. And yeah, I mean, like, you know, ultimately it's like, why would you risk that? Was it worth it? The other thing about the CNET example in particular, another Google principle that's important to pull into here about content is this whole like higher standard with your money, your life content, anything that affects a person's finances. So it's like advice that could potentially lead them down a bad path if you're not a good person to educate them about that topic. And so that kind of like made the discovery of like these AI problems even greater than it had to be with CNET because again, it's like this higher standard of care category in terms of Google ranking content. I'm trying to think if there's one other thing that I wanted to say. I don't think it's in this article, and so this is going outside of the topic we're talking about today. But when we're talking about your money, your life, they also had an example of an article that was about some sort of like savings rate, or it was something about opening like an account and like investing money and rate of return or something like that. And they presented a calculation and the answer that they gave was wrong. And so it's like, so did a human fact checker actually look at this, right? So it's like, did you just say that, or did you actually, like, did a person actually fact check it? But was it still a crutch that, you know, they looked at it, it looked good enough, it seems straightforward. It wasn't like a complicated calculation, which is why this is like wild that it happened. But again, yeah, they didn't catch it. And so that's the problem. In both of these cases, the generative AI copy that they published and they stood behind and they said a human fact checked this had issues where if they had just written it themselves, neither of those things should have happened. So I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that I really want to say. I mean, I think at the end of the day, when we're talking about this topic of is using AI generated content plagiarism, there's definitely a place in the world of content creation for AI, and I think that it can continue to take like a bigger place over time, and then it's like humans are still driving the novelty and really like the experience, right? Like and just making sure that like the text is actually enjoyable for other humans, because I don't think that AI has figured that one out yet. So yeah, there's definitely a place and it will grow. I think that using AI for anything, generative content or anything else, my guiding principle is it can get you from step 1 to 2. It cannot get you from step 1 to 10. Not yet. Also avoid the extremes. It's like, don't just like not use AI, right? Because of like things like what I'm saying, things like what other people are saying. I still use AI, okay? And I use it as part of the content process. We use tools like Phrase and ClearScope for doing some of the topic research and optimizations and things like that. But we still don't use it for the generative. We don't use it for the writing itself, okay? So I think those who avoid it completely are going to be at a disadvantage in the future. Also, those who rely on it completely are going to like start to lose some of their own ability to do the tasks that they outsource to them. So that's like my cautionary tale here. I think as content creators, we have an ethical duty to ourselves and the people we're creating the content for to not overly rely on AI content creation. Ultimately, because we could, in addition to everything I've already said, we could also be hurting somebody else's ability to earn or build a reputation on their original work. And then, yeah, I've kind of already talked about this, not an exhaustive take, but at the Blogsmith, we see the value of AI For things like what I said with like Phrase and ClearScope, I also see it as a great tool for like we use AI tools whenever we meet with clients and we transcribe meetings, and it's really excellent for getting notes or for interviewing people. It prevents us from having to, wildly scribble and get every single detail exactly right. We have the transcript to go back to. And then I think it's also, as I've said, something that can be really great for taking your own body of work and creating efficiencies in your process there. So that's what I've got for you. I hope this actually ended up streaming. It looks like it did, so I'm hopeful, but we'll see what happens. At any rate, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I know this is a little bit of a polarizing subject. It's also a developing one, and my opinions might change 3, 6, 9 months from now, a year from now. It's developing, and so I don't want to say that like this is the only way to think about it. I just want you to consider it. So hopefully I gave you some food for thought today, and I will look forward to seeing you at the next one, which will be a content UX audit. Again, you can use this link at the bottom of the screen to submit your content if you would like me to audit that. And in the meantime, I hope everybody